So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Workforce Wednesday webinar. My name is Kirsten Bayer, and I'm with the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support at Illinois State University. Today's afternoon webinar is regarding WIOA Title 1B performance negotiations for PY 24 and 25. Couple of housekeeping things before we get started. We are on the Zoom webinar platform. So as an attendee, you do not have the ability to unmute yourself or to turn on your camera. However, you can feel free to participate via the chat or the Q&A for any questions or comments, or you can also feel free to raise your Zoom hand when we pause the presentation for Q&A, and I can unmute you and you can have that open discussion with your microphone. We are recording today's webinar, and today's recording will be on our Illinois Workforce Academy website as well as Illinois WorkNet. And we will put the links to both of those URLs in the chat here momentarily. You will also receive a follow-up email tomorrow regarding today's webinar that will have the direct URL links to where you can find the recording and the presentation today as well. I did go ahead and put the slide deck from today in the chat, so you can download that as a PDF if you'd like to use it to follow along or for note-taking purposes today. We also have closed captioning on for accessibility reasons as well. And we will start off with our beginning polls that we're going to do. The first poll is what is your role in the WIOA system? So sorry, I did them backwards, Mark, but for performance specifically, so what is your role in the WIOA system? Are you a local board member, a chief elected official, local board staff, a one-stop operator, a Title I director, systems administrator, career planner, or are you a other WIOA partner or other WIOA stakeholder? So if you could go ahead and answer that poll, we would appreciate it. And we'll give everyone a couple more seconds to do so. We have about half of you that have answered. They're still trickling in. Okay, 85% of you have answered, so we'll go ahead and end that and share the results. Looks like we have a lot of local board staff, Title I directors, Title I system administrators, a couple career planners, and a couple other WIOA partners. So thank you for joining us today. And then our next poll is just where is your local area at today? So if you could go ahead and answer that, if you're from closer to the Chicago area, Northern Illinois, Central, Southern, or if you are joining us statewide. So we'll go ahead and give everyone about 30 to 45-ish seconds to answer this poll. And Kimberly put in the chat that she doesn't see the link to the slides. It could have been Kimberly because I did it right at the beginning. So if you joined just a couple seconds late, no big deal though. I'll go ahead and put them in there again. So I just went ahead and put those in the chat now. Okay, we'll go ahead and end that. It looks like we have a lot of people joining us from up north and central Illinois as well. So we have a good span across the state, which is awesome to see. So thank you for participating. We appreciate it. And I'm going to hand it off to Mark to start today's presentation. If anyone needs anything regarding follow-up from today's webinar, feel free to reach out to me via the chat.
Thank you, Kirsten, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Really appreciate giving us your time. A lot of what we will talk about today might be repetitive to those of you that have been around for a little while and have been participants to negotiations over the past couple of cycles in 2021 and 22-23. So apologize for some of that, but it's still good to go over that, and it's really good to see some new faces. See some turnover in some of our local areas. So we want to make sure they hear the messaging that we've shared previously. There's not a whole lot of changes from those prior year negotiations. But we do have Andy Blank with us today from Northern Illinois University, who will be touching on the local negotiation tool. So look forward to that. That might be new to most of you. If you weren't able to join his webinar back in July, he did give a chat message there, a link to that. So you'll want to go look at that after this session to get a little bit more information about the tool that he may not cover today in the short presentation. Paula, as always, is joining us today. We'll provide some insight as necessary, available to ask questions or answer questions. But please, if you've got any questions during the presentation, make sure you're putting those in the chat. We'll address those as we go along or when we have a break in the information we're providing. As I mentioned, Andy's here today joining us. He and Brian Richard from Northern Illinois University Center for Governmental Studies have been integral to developing the local negotiation tool, as well as the statistical adjustment model that will be used after the program year. So we're happy to have him joining us and covering some of the technical issues of the tool that probably I would not be able to do and give it justification. So again, thanks for Andy joining us. Some of the objectives today, we want to make sure that you understand the process this time around, what all goes into preparing for the local negotiations, developing a negotiation team, what are the factors that you should be incorporating in your discussions and preparations as you prepare to submit proposed goals. We'll talk on a little bit about assessing performance so that you understand what's coming into play here for these program year 24-25 assessments that will occur at the end of each of those years. As I mentioned, Andy will be touching on the negotiation tool. And we've got several slides in the PowerPoint, but he's going to give you a live demonstration. So when we get to that point, you'll want to pay attention to what he's presenting more so than what's on the slides. Those are there for references in case someone wants to go back later and look at the information on the PowerPoint PDF. And then we'll always give you time for comments and questions. And in fact, as we're going through this, if any of you have any best practices you use or any thoughts about how you prepare and go into the negotiations and want to share that with your partners across the state, we hope to have plenty of time for you to do that. So plan on sharing those. We want to hear from you. And it might be something we incorporate into future years, or even if we have the time, we can incorporate into this year's negotiation process. So there are three basic elements to the negotiation process. We're in the planning stages now, development of the tool, providing you guidance such as WIA notices and policy, and getting you ready to submit those proposed goals. We will be giving you in the tool, or you'll be receiving from Andy and the tool, a lot of information, a lot of data that in the last round of negotiations was in a scorecard. It's on the same platform, Power BI, but it's in a different format. So you'll want to see how those differ, but you're getting a lot of data and information that you'll want to incorporate in your discussions among your negotiation team, and want to make sure you are including when you make those decisions in what you're going to propose to us at the state level. You'll want to develop a negotiation team. We highly encourage you have board members, maybe even the board chair, as part of that team. They're the ones that are going to be developing policies and procedures that help you reach your negotiated goals. And so we hope that they're going to be part of those teams, maybe even part of the negotiation themselves. In the past, we generally see 2 or 3 of you, your negotiation teams have board members and chairs participating when we talk with you and come to final agreements. We'd love to see that number increase and show the commitment from those board members on their initiatives and what they're going to do in the next couple of years to help meet your goals. The second step is submitting those proposed goals, or as the guidance labels them, expected levels of performance. We've got a proposal form that's not changing from the last version other than some references. So we'll be getting those out to you. In fact, they may already be uploaded on the website. If not, certainly look for those updates in the attachments to the notice in the next couple of days. We ask that you submit those no later than September 6th. The sooner you get those to us, the better off you're going to be in scheduling. We will go through the same process as we did last time, providing a list of the available dates for negotiations. And the sooner you get in and we review your proposed goals, the sooner you'll be able to pick from a larger selection of dates and times. So, we don't want you rushing into that. It's a very important step to do all your research and planning and development in proposing your goals. But we do want you to know that the later you wait to submit them, the fewer dates may be available or times for you to select from. So time is of the essence. We do have to complete all of these by the end of September and submit them to Department of Labor's Region 5. So our schedule will reflect starting in late August and ending in late September so we can meet that deadline. And then the third element of that is actually conducting of the negotiations. We'll do that through a virtual platform again. We ask that you bring your team together so that you can have some discussions during the call. If maybe we're doing some counter proposals and you want to talk to them and come up with another counter proposal to ours or come to agreement. So the more members you have, the more you have opportunity to have a consensus on what you want to agree to in the calls. We ask that you'll have a team lead identified on the proposal form, and that team lead will actually conduct the negotiation and act on behalf of the board. So again, if you can bring a board member or the board chair to these meetings or the CEO, that would be great. That doesn't mean they're the ones that will lead the conversation, but we do have to have an agreement on who is agreeing for the board on behalf of the board and the local area. A brief timeline of what's been happening and what's going to happen in the next couple of months. We've touched on some of these already. We started these with a state negotiation back in early June. We conducted with Region 5, came to agreements. We'll show you those agreed upon levels of performance or negotiated levels of performance later in the presentation, and they are part of the tool. Andy can show you that. We issued the tool in an email that came from me and went to all Title I administrators as well as the performance leads a couple of weeks ago. We're having today's webinar to give you a little bit more background and information, and then we'll move into the actual planning stage following today's webinar. We'll ask you to submit those proposed goals again by September 6th. If there's a delay in you getting to those, just let Paul and myself know about that so we can plan accordingly with you and understand when you will be able to get us the goals and get something scheduled, just to make sure that we do meet that deadline of September 30th to get all of these into Region 5. And then we'll be conducting these. I got an error on my slide. It should be August 22nd through September 22nd is when we'll be doing these. So I'll correct that. Or you can just write that on your slide deck if you printed that out. So apologize for that oversight there. But again, we want to complete these by the 22nd because the weekend comes shortly thereafter, and we need to make sure we get all of our 22 agreed upon levels to Department of Labor. Some additional things that are occurring is we are updating the notice on the local negotiations process. We've gone through all of our final revisions and just awaiting approval to send that out. I hope that goes out in the next couple of days. So please be looking on the ePolicy website for the revised version. Again, it's very minimal changes from the prior version, except that we've replaced or updated one of the references to the 4 factors to include the local negotiation tool. We will be having a quarterly performance offers hours on August 21st, and on that date, we'll be able to answer any final questions going into our first set of negotiations. So if you have any questions, you can, submit them by email to Paul and I before that date, but we will be prepared to share any final guidance or answer any questions and answers that we receive in email so that everyone hears our response. Again, negotiations are scheduled first in, first selection. So the sooner you can get those into us, the better off you are in choosing from a wider range of dates and times that might suit your negotiation team better. Just briefly, we're negotiating on all 5 measures in each of the 3 Title I programs. None of those have changed at this time. Employment rates, second and fourth quarter, median earnings rate as measured in the second quarter after program exit, credential attainment rate, and the measurable skill gains. And we've done a lot of webinars to help you understand those measures. We'll continue to provide technical assistance as necessary. Teresa Tice from Region 5 did a wonderful job sharing information a couple weeks ago, as well as responding to your questions if you were able to join that. We did have a question on whether that session was recorded, and unfortunately, generally the Region 5 does not record those technical assistance webinars when they're a one-off to a state. So we apologize, but we do have, and Teresa has shared the PowerPoint she used, so please reference those. And if you have any further questions, reach out to Paula and I, and we'll be able to answer those for you. There are 3 levels to performance. Expected level is what you're going to be submitting to us as your proposed starting point to the negotiation. We will then get our calls going, and we will negotiate to final levels for all 15 of those metrics. And then finally, at the end of each program year that we've negotiated for, at the end of PY 24 and 25, we will apply a statistical adjustment model and come out with adjusted levels of performance, which is actually what you're assessed on, not the negotiated, the expected, or the actual, but the adjusted levels of performance. And again, we've done some webinars on that, and we'll do more of that as we lead up to the assessments following PY 24. We're still awaiting final submission of PY 23. And so as a reminder, hold off any questions on that, because we are waiting some of you to put some data in, clarify some information, correct some errors before our staff submit those to DOL in mid-September. Paula will be sending out an email to everyone on some of the issues that we've seen in data checks that the system now is providing us as errors. So we'll get you that information so you can submit those and revise those in the IWDS or Career Connect system. And then we'll issue final PY 23 assessments shortly thereafter. And again, because we did not have a local negotiation tool going into PY 23 negotiations, we are not going to apply a statistical adjustment model after. So it's just going to be the straight old style assessments where we divide the actual by the negotiated and come up with whether you've met the assessed goals or not. So how do you prepare for your negotiations? There are 4 factors that are required and outlined by Department of Labor guidance in the technical employment guidance letters. Those are comparing your performance to other LWIAs across the state. This second one is the one that's updated to reflect that you now have a local negotiation tool that you should use in developing your expected levels of performance and utilizing in the calls with the state for negotiations. We ask that you are considering opportunities to promote continuous improvement, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. And then you always must be considering how you as a local area, local board can assist us at the state level in meeting our goals that we negotiated. Everyone assists in different ways, so don't expect that everyone needs to negotiate at the same level. You'll look at your history and past outcomes and performance and negotiate accordingly. So the first, the third, and the fourth, the first, second, and the fourth bullets there are all contained within the negotiation tool, right, Andy? So all those data points that you'll need are all right there, and Andy will be able to touch on those. So you'll have one source for that. However, these next large bullet point, you may consider other things. You don't have to restrict your reviews and development solely on those 4 factors. So if you have new and updated BLS statistics or data or LMI data or economic information, or you as a board are going to be implementing some new policies or procedures that you think will affect your outcomes, bring those to the table, include those in the proposed goals forum as attachments so that we can prepare and understand where you're coming from in those proposals. So, anything that you think is going to support your position in the proposed goals, please provide us in that attachments to the proposal. And then there's no specific weight on any of these factors. So it's not like if you're high level in comparison to other LWIAs, that's going to strongly relate to how we're going to negotiate with you. It's all information that's weighed equally and determines how we're going to negotiate. So I touched on continuous improvement being one of those. That's not really contained within the negotiation tool because it's more policy, more procedural, more implementation rather than more data and numerical related information. And there's 4 or 5 ways. We've identified 5 here that are also outlined in the TEAGL for states to consider. You can show continuous improvement by indicating in your goal that you plan on improving on your past outcome performances. You may move yourself up in the ranking. So even though you're maybe not asking or negotiating for a much higher rate or goal as a level, you may notice that it is going to take you from a lower standing on the rankings across the 22 local areas to a higher ranking. So consider that as well. You may have some new strategies in serving your participant pool or the ways you're delivering that you might want to consider and share with us. You may change the intensity or comprehensiveness of way you're serving those participants. And then finally, you may only be able to maintain your previous performance because maybe you're one of the higher performing LWIAs with a high level of outcomes. And we can't expect anyone to reach 100%. Obviously, that'd be the ideal goal. And sometimes we do have a few LWIAs that do have some outcomes near or at 100% when they have a smaller pool of participants. But we will recognize that you're at high level and maybe can't increase that, but show us some other opportunities of where you're going to show continuous improvement. Maybe address the goals, the levels for a different indicator performance that you want to focus on rather than the ones that you're exceedingly doing well on over the historical time. Here are some of those as well, just kind of in a graphic format for quick reference. Share anything you can with us. We want to hear from you on how you think you're continuously improving as a system in your local area or region. I'm going to turn it over to Andy now. Here are some highlights of what's found in the negotiation tool. Quite a bit of information. He's going to show you a live demonstration, which will do a lot more justification than sharing just some PowerPoint slides. So Andy, take it away.
Thanks, Mark. So share my screen. Here we go. So in previous webinar, I did a bit of a SAM 101 where I went over some history of how we developed the negotiation tool, what some of the terminology is, how we get at the model prediction. So this is going to be more of a SAM 201 course. It's not going to focus so much on data definitions, methodology, or that sort of thing. We're going to focus more on how you can actually use the negotiation tool and how you can make the data make sense for your local area. So in chat, I posted a link to the negotiation tool. It's a bit.ly URL. When you paste it into your browser, you're going to get something larger. That's fine. It's because bit.ly just redirects you to that site. But this is the landing page for the negotiation tool. It just gives you some introductory information about how we're required to provide this based on Department of Labor mandates. And it's to help you set your expected levels of performance during negotiations. So throughout the data tool, there's a simple color scale where blue is always pertaining to second quarter employment. Dark blue is fourth quarter employment. Purple is wages, and so on. These aren't links. It's just establishing the color scale that is used throughout the tool. So if you click anywhere on this tool, it's not going to take you anywhere because the navigation panel is actually at the bottom right here. So this is just a navigation system that's built into the Power BI platform. And the arrows that are pointing left and right will take you forward and back pages. If you click on the bottom center, it will bring up the whole list of pages so that you can skip around in the report that way. So if we just wanted to go to the appendix, we can go there, and then we can go right back to the introduction. If you accidentally click this, but you want it to go away so you can see your data again, just click that 1 of 31 again, and then it will disappear. So there's 31 pages of data, but you don't have to go through them one page at a time. And now the second page is a glossary of terms in case you'd like a recap from the previous webinar, or in case anything you just like it summarized again. This page will be there for your reference before you dive into the data. So then the first thing of substance in the negotiation tool is going to be the executive summary. So there are going to be 2 pages that summarize at a very high level how do the negotiation tool's predicted performance thresholds for your LWIA compare against how you performed in the past, what your negotiated goals were in the past, and what was the state goal that was negotiated with DOL for this year. So you can see at a summary level, how does your bottom line performance prediction stack up against how you performed in the past and how it might contribute towards the statewide goal. Now, these simulated performances, or what the model would predict your performance outcome to be, they aren't necessarily tied to these actuals or to the goal in program year 23. It's just provided as a frame of reference so you can see, is the model setting a higher or lower bar for us based on how we performed in the past. So on each of these tables, it's just a comparison of your model prediction against actual performance. Longer bars just mean a higher bar to meet for performance. So bar is fuller as it gets closer to 100. And then along the right side are some bar graphs just showing how the different performance predictions compare by program. So you can see which program has the highest predictions, which one has the lowest predictions. Dislocated worker will always have the longest bar for median earnings because those participants start out with more work experience. By the same token, youth always have the lowest bar for median earnings because they start out with the least work experience. So if you want to share some high-level information with other stakeholders about, at a high level, how does the negotiation tool predict our performance compared to how we did in the past, the executive summary is what you would share for that. And if you would like a PDF of just these executive summaries for your LWIA, you can email me and I can send one of those to you. So it's just divided across 2 pages in the interest of readability and simplicity. So whenever you're seeing blue, it's an employment rate. Whenever you're seeing orange, it's credential attainment, and so on. Now, if you see these simulated performance thresholds and you're wondering why it's so different from your actuals, and you're wondering what goes into that calculation, we have you covered for that. So after the executive summary, we have some detailed results pages where you can see how each data point contributes to that simulated performance threshold. So just as an example, these are the detailed results for adult second quarter employment rates. If you're on a page and you're trying to figure out which measure of performance is being shown, you can check the title along the top of the page. So it says adult second quarter employment. You can also click the bottom center and it will highlight which page you are on. So those are 2 ways you can tell what's going on these tables. And if you'd like to see the data for your LWIA, you can click in the upper right corner, you can change them. We provide the results for all LWIAs on this tool, and we're able to do that because there's no personally identifiable information in this data set. It's all shown as percentages of total participants. There's no way you can tie it together, so you can't see how many people would have combinations of each characteristics. So let's walk through a bit what's going on one of these tables, because there is a lot in there. So by default, when you go to one of these detailed results pages, it's going to be sorted by the weighted actual, or bottom line, how much does each of these variables contribute to your simulated performance. So the way we get that weighted actual is we multiply your actual percentages in program year 2022. So in this case, LWIA 5, about 70% of their participants in the adult program employment cohort were ages 25 to 44. We multiply that by the coefficient, which is a number summarizing the relationship between this and your performance outcome. And by multiplying these 2, we get what's called a weighted actual, or it's this weighted by this. So then to get the simulated performance here, we add all the way down this column, and that takes us to this. So we multiply across, we add down, that takes us to a bottom line performance prediction. So what this 69% is saying is that based on the participant characteristics and economic conditions in LWIA 5 as of program year 2022, we would expect their employment rate after 2 quarters to be 69%. And you'll see some gray text along the bottom of that gauge chart that says, without guardrails, the simulated performance would be this. Now, a guardrail is something that we place in the model that establishes minimum simulated performance thresholds in the data. And the reason we do this is to balance the state's need to meet its negotiated statewide goals with the need for the negotiation tool to provide reasonable performance predictions for each LWIA. So there are some cases where your simulated performance would be larger than what we would actually get by adding down these columns, and that would be where the guardrail would be applied. So we show that footnote just for transparency so you can see whether or not a guardrail is being applied in the results for your LWIA. But the main thing you should focus on going into negotiations is going to be these simulated performance thresholds. And there will be one of these pages for each measure of performance that is being negotiated. So we've got 3 pages for second quarter employment, 3 pages for median earnings, 3 pages for credential attainment, and so on. And they're all color-coded by the same color scale that was established on the first page. So these darker blues are going to be for fourth quarter employment, and so on. So after the detailed results, we also have an appendix that can be used for one of the components of negotiations where you're comparing against other LWIAs and you're including some consideration for continuous improvement. So we have 5 pages where you specifically can compare your outcomes against other LWIAs on that same measure. And on each of these pages, we also show a yellow bar for the statewide outcome. Now, these don't necessarily factor into your assessed performance, but it's one more thing you can consider when setting what you expect your performance to be going into those negotiations. And then we also have a few pages where you can compare your performance outcomes over time. So you can compare any LWIA against any other LWIA. So just for example, you can do LWIA 1, LWIA 7, and statewide. And you can select as many number of LWIAs as you want on this page, but you have to be cautious because if you have too much, it's going to become unreadable. So if I don't select anything, note that the Power BI platform will show everything by default, and it looks like I spilled a bowl of M&Ms on my screen. I don't like that, so I'm going to fix that. I'm just going to select something again. And now my bar graphs are clean. So if by accident you select too much data, just select any geography and your screen will be clean again. So these pages with the actuals over time are one more data point you can consider when you're thinking about continuous improvement. So you could think about continuous improvement in the sense that our outcomes for participants improving over time. And that's one way you can use that actuals over time data. Or you might also notice that outcomes might not necessarily be increasing, but you can point to a time when you're serving more participants with barriers. So that might be another consideration for continuous improvement, not just the bottom line outcome threshold, but are you serving people that are harder to serve? So that's a high level overview of how to navigate the negotiation tool. But now I'm going to go a step further and give you a couple of detailed use cases for how you can make this data make sense for your local area as you're getting ready for those negotiations and as you're thinking about what you want to submit as your expected levels of performance. I wanted to go a step beyond just, here's the data, you figure out what to do with it. I want to flip the script around and I want to say, here are some ways that you might want to think about using that data based on conditions that you're experiencing in your local area. So to do that, I'm going to focus on 3 particular use cases. One is going to be a simulation based on economic shifts. So say you're anticipating some layoffs, you're anticipating an increase in unemployment, and you want to figure out how would the statistical adjustment model judge us differently based on a change in economic circumstance. Another scenario I'm going to look at is how would our performance change if we were to serve a different mix of participants? What would happen if we were to take on more participants with barriers due to, say, a change in grant funding? And then a third case I'm going to talk through is how do you think about suggesting a different expected level of performance if what you're seeing in the negotiation tool is fairly different from what you're used to seeing in your actual performance outcomes and in how your LWIA has typically negotiated in the past? So those are going to be 3 examples I'm going to walk you through. So for the first one, let's think about some economic conditions. So for this one, I'm going to go to adult second quarter employment. And suppose you're in a local area that has experienced considerable growth in the transportation and logistics sector. And as a result of that, your employment base has been pretty good. You've had a pretty low unemployment rate, pretty good employment outcomes for your participants. But then suddenly you find out that some major warehousing companies in your area have announced layoffs. So that past growth you've seen in the transportation and logistics sector, that's probably going to change. You're probably going to see some decreases in transportation employment. And at the same time, your unemployment rate might increase. So how can we think about how that might play out in the statistical adjustment model if your economy were to change? To do that, we're going to play around with the coefficients, and we're going to brush aside some other things in this model. So first off, whenever we're doing these what-if scenarios, you want to set aside what's currently there for the simulated performance. You're going to set aside the actuals and the weighted actuals. We're just going to focus on the coefficients based on some new hypothetical actuals. So to do that, we're going to sort by economic conditions. I did that by sorting on this column. So now we just see the economic conditions. So trade, transportation, and utilities employment grew by about 7% in LWIA 6 over the past year. That has a coefficient of 0.522. And due to that growth and that strong coefficient, that would have contributed a 3.6% increase in expected employment outcomes for your exiters. But let's say transportation employment was going to decrease 10% due to those layoffs that were just announced. In this case, we're going to just brush that 6.9% aside, and we're going to put in a new number on an Excel spreadsheet or on a pen and paper. Let's change that to minus 10%. So minus 10 times 0.52. That's going to be about a minus 5.2% just due to that. So if everything else in the LWIA were to stay the same, but transportation employment were to decrease 10%, then that means that the model would predict your employment outcomes for your exiters to decrease 5% during that time due to the decrease in transportation employment. And now let's suppose that there's also a change in the unemployment rate that goes with those layoffs and that decrease in transportation employment. In that case, we would brush aside the 3.6 employment rate that's in this cell here, and we're going to change that to say 5%, so that we multiply that by the 0.279, and we would get a new weighted actual for the unemployment rates. Now note that the coefficient for unemployment rate is a positive. That means that LWIAs that typically have a higher unemployment rate have a better employment outcome for their exiters. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's because of the unemployment rate that they're having better outcomes. This is just saying that at a high level, possibly due to other confounding factors like population size, total employment size, but those LWIAs with a higher unemployment rate tend to have higher outcomes. So that's just something to keep in mind. It's not any sort of statement on cause. But what we would find is that the change in transportation employment would outweigh the change in unemployment for this. And as you're working through these sorts of what-if scenarios, you're probably going to notice that a change in any one particular industry is probably not going to have a drastic effect on what the model would predict for your outcomes, but it would have some effect. So just for planning purposes, if you want to think about what would happen if some industries were to grow or decrease, how would the model affect your performance that way? That's how you would do these. Now, the negotiation tool is not used to predict your economy. It's not used to predict the future of your participants, but in this case, it's just used for running what-if scenarios for planning purposes. So that's how you can think about that. So if you want to run what-if scenarios with different economic conditions, you would brush aside the values in these cells, but you would keep this. So you would multiply a new value here by what you get here. And that would give you a new weighted actual, just show all else kept equal, what would that have on our expected employment rates? So that's use case one, thinking about new economic what-if scenarios. Now let's think about changes in participant characteristics. So let's go to dislocated worker earnings in an LWIA that did not have any participants with disabilities or cultural barriers, but suppose they were to get a grant specifically to serve more participants with this characteristic. So I'm going to go to dislocated worker earnings. And LWIA 2 as an example. So just an example, let's see here. So LWIA 2 is a local area. Their dislocated worker program did not have any participants with cultural barriers. They didn't have any participants that were English language learners. So let's suppose that they got a grant to serve those target populations. And let's suppose that with this new grant funding, instead of serving 0 participants with cultural barriers and serving 0 participants that are English language learners, let's suppose that both of these percentages increase from 0% to 10%. So how would that change the expected performance outcome just based on that change in participants? If we want to think about that effect, we're going to brush aside everything here. We're going to brush aside this. We're just going to focus on multiplying a new value here by the current value here. So in this case, if we were to say 10% of participants have cultural barriers, we're going to multiply that by the minus 9,000 here. So that would be minus 900 for that cell. So that would be saying that if LWIA 2 were to serve 10% participants with cultural barriers, then we would expect their dislocated workers to have median earnings of about $900 less just due to that change in participant characteristics, all else held equal. Now, if those participants are also English language learners, the same 10%, we would multiply that 10% by the minus 10,000 there. So that would give us about minus 1,000. So if there was a change in grant funding that were to raise the share of participants with cultural barriers and who are English language learners up to 10% each, that would in effect have a $2,000 decrease in what we'd expect their median earnings to be. So that's an example of how you can think about a change in your participant characteristics, changing how the model would predict your performance to play out. So that's one thing you might be able to play around with for planning purposes if you want to think about what sort of performance outcome you can expect for your LWIA as a whole if you were to take on more participants with specific target populations or with specific barriers. So a final use case I'm going to think about is, how do you think about suggesting a new anticipated level of performance? What you're seeing in the simulation is different from how your LWIA usually performs and from what you're usually seeing after you agree on a target in negotiations. So for this example, I'm going to go to an LWIA that has a large white population where there seem to be coefficients pointing in different directions for the fourth quarter employment rates. So let's go to LWIA 25. And the only reason I'm picking these examples for each use case is just because the data seems to be easy to explain in those scenarios. The conditions in your local area could be different. Oh, and something I forgot to mention earlier is that when you see these gray arrows pointing up or down in the tool, that's just showing which coefficients have the largest positive or negative effect, not necessarily what has the largest effect for your local area in particular, just showing statewide these were the biggest positive or negative coefficients. So something interesting that's happening in LWIA 25 is that 88% of their participants are white. That has a positive effect on expected employment rates. But they also have a large percentage of participants that have education less than high school, and a lot of participants that are low income. Now, in the model, it's finding that participants that are low income, those LWIAs tend to have higher performance outcomes overall, but that might be due to overlapping factors such as the employment base, population size, and so on. It isn't strictly saying that people with low income have better performance outcomes. It's saying that the LWIAs with more low income typically have better outcomes just due to other factors. But in this case, it's possible that the effect of the white population in the negotiation tool is overpowering the effect of the share of the population with barriers, even though it's entirely possible that the white participants in LWIA 25 have other barriers that would prevent them from having a successful employment outcome, not necessarily just because they are white. So in this case, the 88% white, that might not have as much of an effect as we think when we factor in about 74% of them have education less than high school. About a third are unemployed at entry. About 13% have disabilities and so on. So as you're thinking about, oh, the simulated performance seems too high, we're going to submit a different level of performance. Sit down with your career planners, other on-the-ground staffs, ask them what kind of barriers are they seeing in their participants? Is there something that they're seeing, any combination of barriers that is not being captured directly in the negotiation tool? That's the sort of thing that you can discuss during your negotiations. So when you see this simulated performance and you think that isn't quite right, that's the sort of thing we want to discuss during the negotiation process. And if you dive into your data and you're seeing where the barriers are, that's how you might be able to think about suggesting a new performance target as you're going into those negotiations. So those were 3 examples of how to dive into the data for your local area in the negotiation tool, how you can think about different economic scenarios where employment might decrease in some industries. I talked about how you might be able to plan for different changes in your target populations, and I talked about how to think about barriers in your participants that might not always be consistently captured in the negotiation tool. Something we have to keep in mind is that the data that we provide in the negotiation tool is what we can provide consistently for each local area. We know that barriers overlap, but we can't capture every single combination of barriers in the negotiation tool, at least not for every local area. So you might see some interactions of barriers like disability and veteran status that we weren't able to capture because we could only show veteran and disability status separately. So those are some things you might think about as you are working through the negotiation tool. With that, I can take any questions you might have. Thank you.
Okay, so if you have any questions, you can feel free to raise your hand and I can unmute you, or you can ask them in the chat.
As we're waiting for those, Andy, if you wouldn't mind going back and just showing one of those examples of the characteristics, I wanted to point out a couple things.
Sure. Oh, and something I'll add is that for those that don't have my email, it's right here on the cover page of the negotiation tool. So yeah, if anyone would like a PDF of their results, you can just email me and I can send you the results for your LWIA.
So a couple things here, and then Paul, I may need to have you clarify what your question is on the threshold. But when you look through this list, there are three things to consider. When we at the state level get our characteristics and economic conditions from DOL, there's about 50 some included in that. There was a work group that included NIU, Andy and Brian, as well as several local representatives that identified some of those characteristics and economic conditions not being reflective of Illinois as a whole. And so they were removed. So this list is quite a bit shorter than what we see at the state level over various states. And so you may think that there's something missing here, and there probably is, but that's because it's just not reflective well enough across all 22 LWIAs. Andy kind of alluded to that, but I want to just make clear that things were removed for a reason. There was a work group that decided on that. It wasn't just randomly chosen. But there are also items that aren't in here because they're, for example, female is here, but male is not. We know that in this instance, female is 49.3% of the population of participants. That must mean that in today's recording and reporting, just over 50% were male. And so you'll see some things missing, and Amy might be able to speak to that a little bit more, but sometimes they're missing also because they're kind of what's the word I'm thinking of, Andy? They're
in some cases, it's a target population that might be, in some cases, there are target populations that are well, they might have significant barriers. It's just not one that we can consistently show the data for in each LWIA. And something more nuanced I was talking about is, so for example, we know that low income would be a barrier. We know that being unemployed entry is a barrier. We know that youth parenting, that would also be a barrier. But what we can't do is have a variable specifically for people who are youth parents and unemployed at entry and returning citizens or something like that. Chances are someone with multiple of these target population characteristics is going to have different labor market outcomes than someone that might only have one barrier. But in the interest of having data that's consistent for every local area, we can't get into that level of nuance in this tool. That's the sort of thing that you might be able to think about as you are suggesting a new expected level of performance that would be different from what you're seeing on these charts here.
Okay, great, thanks. And then finally, as you're thinking about and using this tool, Andy talked about how changing a variable would change the expected level there, or the simulated value. As you prepare for your proposed goals, you can't predict necessarily what the outcomes are going to be. At the end of the year, the statistical adjustment model will account for that. So what you don't want to do is go in and say, well, I think this is what's going to happen, and so I'm going to try to negotiate to that. And then if that doesn't happen, or it happens at a higher level, the adjustment negatively affects you. So be careful in how you are trying to predict what your population is outside of what the data itself tells you, as contained within the tool for your LWIA. What we can say is your priority should be serving people with the most barriers to employment, most challenges. The more that you can capture of those, and sometimes that's simply a means of capturing them. Maybe the individual has the barrier, but you haven't been made aware of that, or you haven't reported it in the system of record. So we need you to make sure you're capturing those. You're working with the participant to share all of the barriers that they might have, so that you can not only record them and report them in your system, but also so you can develop the appropriate career plan for that individual that addresses all of those barriers. And each of those barriers have a different effect on your actual adjusted outcomes at the end of the year. But generally speaking, the more barriers you can capture, the better off you're going to be as far as meeting your goals, because those are going to generate the appropriate adjustments that we'll be making at the end of the program year. So Paul's saying currently in LWIAs, it shows a threshold for performance of 90%. In IPASS, it's set at 70%, which is what your assessment is. We've agreed on that about 3 years ago. We're supposed to use IPASS numbers. Is there going to be a threshold still? And if so, what will that be? We'll talk about that here in a moment. Paul, what your actual assessment will be based on. We wanted to get through the negotiation part of this phase, so I'll touch on that. Appreciate the question and reminder.
Yeah, something I'd like to add quickly on that is that at this stage in the game, no thresholds are being applied. That's all going to come up during the assessment process. So what you're seeing in the negotiation tool, and you see that simulated performance, we are not going to be assessing you against that. When we apply the threshold, it's going to be based on what you set during the negotiations. Now, you don't have to submit the simulated performance threshold as your expected level of performance, and that's not necessarily what DCEO is going to negotiate to. These are just going to be the starting point. We are not applying any thresholds at this point.
Yeah, great point, Andy. And we've done very well, I think. Hopefully you all agree in the feedback we've received the last 2 negotiations especially, but done very well in coming to agreement on our negotiated goals, on your negotiated goals, I should say. I don't expect that to change. Don't go into these thinking it's going to be a tough negotiation. Hopefully it isn't. But what Andy just said is true, that what you see in the tool isn't even necessarily where we want to start you at. Some people interpret that at the state level when we receive the tool from DOL, that's where the region that they're negotiating with was going to start at. All of the data that's available is where we're going to start at. It's going to dictate that. and the tool isn't perfect. So come with what you think is appropriate for you. Propose what you think is appropriate. If we have a difference in opinion on that, we'll have our starting point and we'll come to an agreement between there. It might land on what this tool says and it might not. But don't come thinking this is the state's starting point and that you somehow have to get up to it when you think what you have in front of you, what you're reviewing, doesn't support it. We would agree with you. If it doesn't support it, we're not going to try to come to an agreement on something that is too high or too low. We have had some that have submitted really low proposals, and we had to kind of talk through that with them in the negotiation and ask them why they think it's so low, and we would come to an agreement that we can come up lower. So come up from that lower number to a higher number. So use the data appropriately in your planning and propose what you think is best for you, and we'll get in the calls and go from there. I'm going to go back to sharing the PowerPoint and pick up there. As Andy pointed out, I mentioned earlier, the tool has the state negotiated levels, but here are all of those in one simple slide. This is what we negotiated, and it's a little bit of a change from what we did in the past. In fact, our guidance in a Q&A said, we really don't want to negotiate two different levels for the two program years you're negotiating. But going forward, we're not going to hold to that. If we think you're coming into PY 2024, and let's just use the measurable skill gain like we've got there, and we think you should be able to achieve 65% in PY 24, but through additional technical assistance, through additional reporting guidance, we think you can get to 67% the second year, PY 25. Expect that we might have a negotiation where your 2 years are different. As you see on this sheet, we had quite a few differences in the credential and measurable skill gains across the three programs. So contrary to the last negotiations where we tried to get the same level for both years, we do recognize and can see in the data that maybe it's a continuous improvement process where you can achieve one level in the first year, but what we expect that you would achieve a higher level the next year. It's not going to be a significant difference. As you see here, ours are only 0.5% or 1%. It's not like we're going to necessarily ask for you to improve 5 or 10% from one year to the next. The data, again, will support if there's a need to have differences across the 2 years and what those differences might be. So don't think that you're held to one number for both years. If you think your planning says one number the first year and a little bit higher the next year, bring that to the table. We want to hear about it. So what do you do in proposing your goals? There's a proposal form that you need to submit. As we mentioned, we'd like to see those by September 6th. If there's any reason why you can't meet that deadline, please reach out to myself and Paula as early as you know that you're not going to be able to reach that. Maybe you're waiting for some chief elected official and board chair signatures and just taking a little bit longer than you expected. We'll work with you to get those submitted. We can't really set a date because what we don't want to do is enter a negotiation without having those confirmed by the chair and the CEO. So we'll work with you. Maybe we'll set a date way out in the future, but probably not. We've done that in the past just to get something on our schedule, but we have to make sure we have those proposals in hand before we can actually hold a negotiation so that we know the board, the CEO, and your team are all on the same page in an agreement on what you're proposing. We ask that you include attachments of all the supporting data and information to rationalize why you're submitting the proposals that you are. That can come in any form. It could be PDFs, could be Word, could be Excel, whatever you feel best can express what you're trying to share with us. And again, down at the bottom, we do need signatures from the chairs and the CEOs. That's one exception we can't make. We need them on board with what you're negotiating too. And then we'll schedule those calls once we receive and review and agree that we've received everything that we need. So we won't, again, schedule those until we have that in hand. Submit those to me, carbon copy Paula in case I happen to be out for a day. We can jump on those and reviewing them and get back to you and show you what dates and days and times are still available and get you on our calendar. We'll be making available maybe 30 to 32 dates and times, maybe a little bit more than that. So there should be several options available to you, even if you come in late and closer to that September 6th date. But again, it might be limited in when your team is available. So we want to get those in early. After we get the proposals, schedule the calls. The third part of this all is doing the negotiation. Again, I mentioned that we have had really good conversations with you in coming to those agreements. I don't expect anything different moving forward. We'll open with a conference, just telling you again, reminding you what we're negotiating for, all of the measures we're negotiating to, make sure that we have agreement on who is speaking for your board and your local area in those calls. They're the ones that will do the negotiation. They're the ones that ultimately will come to agreement. You can bring your entire team to those calls. That doesn't mean it's only that individual that should be on them. But you can converse amongst that team throughout the process. So if you offer one goal and we counter propose with something else, and you don't know if you want to agree to that, you can talk with your members, come back to the call and share what you think you can counter with as well. Generally, we have one or two counter proposals each way on some of these. Some of these we come to a quick agreement on once we get into the call. So be prepared to have those conversations on the side. We'll be doing the same thing with our team. And then finally, we'll have a closing conference where I will generally be the one confirming with your lead on each of the 15 measures to make sure that we're on the same page. And then we'll send out a confirmation letter within the next week to week and a half to your board chair, your CEOs, and we'll make sure to carbon copy the board staff, the Title I administrator, and the performance individual to confirm that we've agreed on these levels. Once we've got 22 negotiations confirmed and the letter sent out, we will inform Region 5 at DOL that we've done that and what those goals are. They require that we have to submit those to them upon completion of all of the negotiations. So to Paul's question, what are we assessing for? There's 3 different assessments that really captures more than 15 measures because of what are called overall scores. So starting in program year 2024, again, we kind of stopped utilizing a SAM back in PY21 through the 23 negotiations or assessments because we didn't have a tool to provide you going into those. So the last 3 years, including the current one that we'll be assessing in the next few months, will not have a statistical adjustment model applied to it. So what you see is kind of what you get. Once we finalize what you've submitted in the management system, whether it be LWIAs or Career Connect, you'll be able to calculate your outcomes immediately because it's the actual outcome divided by the negotiator rate. It's kind of, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, it's kind of the old school way of looking at performance where it was a simple calculation. So that will stop when we assess program year 2024 and going forward beyond that, where we will be using the adjusted levels as the means of doing the calculation. We have the individual indicator score, so you'll be measured 15 times on individual indicator scores. That's all 5 of the individual indicators for all 3 of the Title I programs. You'll also have an overall program score that measures how you've done across each of those 3 programs, and you'll have overall indicator scores, so there'll be 5 of those that'll show how you've done across the 3 programs for each of those 5 indicators. The statistical adjustment model, without going into too much depth, great to have Andy here in case you do have some questions on the statistical adjustment model. But it's intended to level the playing field. It takes into account what actually occurs versus what we predicted utilizing the tool going into the program year. So that if you, for some reason, have some event that we couldn't account for in that tool, in those predicted outcomes, this will take into account those participant characteristics and or the economic conditions that truly existed at the end of the program year. It's just an objective way that DOL assesses states that we also now will be assessing all of you at the local level. We ask that you negotiate fairly as to what you think you can achieve, and we'll worry about the outcomes afterwards when we get all the data and information. That's kind of the easy way and simplest way to put it. The targets will change based on those actual characteristics of the participants and economic conditions. So what are the levels you're assessed against? Each of those individual single indicator scores need to be at 75% of the adjusted level of performance after the SAM is applied. So again, 15 times we'll be looking and seeing if you reach 70%. Then the overall program scores, whether they be for either of the three programs, have to be at 90%. And I'll show you an example of how this works out here in a moment. And similarly, the overall indicator scores have to be at 90% as well. If any of those 15, 3 or 5 outcomes and assessments are not met, then unsuccessful occurs at the local level. And there's a 3-year plan of what applies as sanctions for unsuccessful in 2 consecutive years for the same metric. Here's one example of successful all across the board. If you look up and down the columns, you'll see that everything met at least 70%. So each of the individual indicator scores were met. As you calculate the averages across the columns, you'll see that everything met at least 90% in all 5 of those overall indicator scores. And then if you look at the bottom of the 3 columns, you'll see that 90% was met in each of the 3 programs. So this is an example of a successful performance. This next screen shows where just one unsuccessful individual indicator score could jeopardize 3 of your outcomes. So in this case, the Title I adult employment rate changed. It was less than 70%. Everything else stayed the same as the successful example previously. But because that was so low after adjustments, it also negatively affected the overall indicator score for employment rate 4th quarter and negatively affected overall program score for the adult program, because those 2 both fell under 90%. So it's important to achieve 70% in all of these. And the next example will show where 70% may not quite be enough. So maybe you improved and you didn't, you met the adult employment rate 4th quarter, but just at 70%. Nothing else changed again, except we went from 63% to 70%. You've met all of the individual indicator scores. It brought your adult score up to above 90%. So you've met each of the 3 overall program scores. But because of the 3 program scores in the employment rate 4th quarter, 90% was not met for the overall program score there. I'm sorry, the overall indicator score, because it fell under 90%. So you're looking to achieve more than the 70% so that you don't jeopardize potentially reaching those 2 90%. The state has held at those 90%. That's why we are assessing at local areas at the 90% in those. And again, when you're looking at this table, you're seeing 15 individual indicator scores, 3 overall program scores, and 5 overall indicator scores. If you are unsuccessful in any one of those calculations for 2 consecutive years, that's when sanctions apply, not for an inability to meet them in 1 year. So we hopefully catch it if it happens in that 1st year and correct it for the 2nd year, subsequent year. So in 24, if you maybe missed, in this case, the overall indicator score for employment rate 4th quarter, let's make sure we make some changes. Let's get some technical assistance. Maybe it's a matter of capturing some employment that you that actually occurred, but you didn't get into the system in time, and it caused you to not be successful in meeting that overall. Let's make sure we're getting everything in the system. Let's make sure we're working with our employers to get more employment from our outcomes, from our participants as they exit our program. whatever it is, we will be available to provide technical assistance so that you don't have an unsuccessful in that same overall indicator score for employment rate fourth quarter, a second program year in a row. And again, everything resets. Once you meet and are successful in any of them, you start the clock the following year if potentially you have an unsuccessful. That brings us to everything we wanted to cover today. What I'd like to do in this question and answer, not only answer any of your questions from what was presented today, either by Andy or myself, but also I'd like to ask some of you if you'd like to share some of the processes and the planning that you conduct over the last couple of years or couple cycles in preparing to submit proposed goals or going into the negotiation calls. I think it'd be beneficial to some of your other local areas to hear from you if you think you have done something in planning and preparing for these that others should hear from. Does anyone have any examples of how you prepare that you'd like to share with everyone? And Kirsten, I can't see the hands raised if anyone does. I'd really like to hear from some of the local areas. You're all doing great things. We've done tremendous things across our local areas over the last several years in meeting all of our goals, as well as, like I said, all of the negotiations have been very cordial and we've come to agreements fairly in a successful manner. So like to hear from all of you.
No one currently has their hand raised, but.
All right, I could pick on some of our technical assistance team. I don't want to do that, but any of you, you've been part of all of the preparation for a lot of our technical assistance. You're not shy to speaking up in those meetings. So if any of you want to share something, please do. There's several of them on the call today.
Okay, we have Rick Stubblefield.
Rick, how you doing? Great seeing you back at the WIA Summit. Miss seeing you and some of the others like we used to when we used to get together a lot more often. But Rick, go ahead.
Yeah, and I don't have a lot here. I was just trying to kind of follow along. Obviously, I'm not quite as deep into it as some of the others are, but I think it's just going to be a matter of digesting what we have going. I think the negotiation process, at least for us, has always been two-sided and fair. So, we'll dive into this and come up with numbers that seem to fit our area, and I'm sure we can work together to come to a consensus.
Appreciate that. I think so. So too. I think the tool will be helpful. Again, if your thinking is a little bit off of what the projection is, the simulation has produced, don't feel like you've got to stretch yourself to get beyond that. We may be in the same boat as we're looking at your local area, and we may not be looking at that number as our starting point. So come to an agreement among your team and submit what you think is accurate. I don't think Paula may be able to help speak without going back and looking. I don't think we had a lot, or maybe even a handful, where we were far off of where the local areas were wanting to start at over the course of these last couple. I think surprisingly, with 22 LWIAs and 15 measures, we've done a good job of kind of coming to close to agreements before we even entered into those negotiations. So it really was an easy process in coming to agreement for all of them overall. And LaDonna is sharing that she thinks the key is to know your pool of exiters. And then appreciate your comment that it's been very easy to work with Mark, Paul and I should say. Sometimes Julio hops on our call. Sometimes our regional managers will join in. And so, be aware we may have as many as 5 on our calls as well. Generally, Julio or myself are leading the calls, Paula as well as covering some of those metrics. But yeah, I've really enjoyed them because they have been, good, constructive conversations with our ability to come to agreement fairly easy. Anyone else want to share with everyone else some of their thoughts? Anyone new to this process that are just totally lost or confused and have a question that you'd like to have us address today? Paula, did we cover everything that we talked about? Anything that I might have overlooked?
Did I miss us? Did we ask anyone if they had tips for where to begin to tackle the planning and to start getting their teams ready to come up with expected?
No, that's a good point. Do all of you have like a worksheet that you've developed, or how do you pull all your information together to assess this? Now that you got the tool, some of it's going to be right there, but in the past, have you put together? That's what we do is we put together 22 spreadsheets and just capture all the data from several years. The tool now has it for us, so some of what we've done in the past we won't have to do because it's right there in that tool. But what are some of the things, some of the tools you've used in the past, or what are some of the additional information and data points that you brought to the table when you were discussing amongst your team that you utilized in coming to decide on what you're proposing?
Okay, Rick is going to talk again.
I don't mind talking. Normally what happens is staff, and I think primarily it's Cindy Lehman and team will put together some numbers and some spreadsheets, and then we'll have some conversations about what's changed throughout our region over the past year, the past couple of years. Have we lost any businesses? Have there been any big layoffs? Do we have anything coming on board that's new that might add? We kind of work with what's happened in the past and what we expect is going to happen in the future. A big layoff can make a huge difference in where you're going to be from a performance standpoint.
That's a good example of a piece that can be used for the continuous improvement factor, I think, and how different team members will probably be able to be assigned different tasks. Like some are more deep into the data and exits, like LaDonna's point. And then Rick, you would be able to provide that general overall service delivery and things happening like that. Sorry, that's just my opinion on some of it.
Yeah, there are just going to be certain things that you're not going to know about our area that does, that statistical information isn't going to be able to know that you're going to only get from us locally.
Exactly. So we'll have like your quantitative versus qualitative analysis and those situational things that just have to be talked about in negotiations, I think.
Yeah. And I really like LaDonna's comment about know your future exiters, because everything you see in the negotiation tool, we're using program year 22 data to try and guess at what your outcome might be in 24. But you're going to know better than us that your exiters in PY 24 might be different from what we were seeing in 22. So if you know your future exiters, that's going to be more leverage for you and suggesting a different expected level of performance. We have to use PY 22 data because it's what we had complete, but there's going to be some limitations on that.
Yeah, I think that's good to note, Andy, because we have to use complete data to develop the tool, but that doesn't mean we have to use only complete program year data in preparing for this. So, PY 23 is over. We kind of know all of our data. We don't have everything in. We haven't submitted to DOL, so there could be some changes. And that's why we can't include it in the tool, because we don't have final program year characteristics, final economic conditions yet. But if you know of some situations, some characteristics of what occurred in PY23, please bring that to the table. Let us know. You maybe saw a shift in something during PY23 that the tool didn't account for. Let us know, and you know, we'll discuss that with you. Yeah, LaDonna's indicating Excel. That's what we create as a spreadsheet or a worksheet, is using Excel, because we can, you know, we can manipulate data or bring data together and find averages. We utilize it to track the negotiation call as well. David spoke to their client list, has a higher than usual dropout rate for GED students. So that's good to know as you try to predict the future. So, you know, the one of the drawbacks of the tool is that we do have to wait for end of program year information, and we're already beyond the end of PY23 and just don't have that information to include in the tool. So there could be, you know, something that happened in the last 12 months that you want to point out that is important to where your starting point is for the negotiation.
We update the model whenever we can, but there's always going to be that time lag. So best we can do is just update the model again when it becomes time to run those performance assessments.
Any other thoughts someone might want to share? This is great to hear from some of you on how you're preparing. Hopefully the other LWIAs are finding benefit in that, and maybe you can utilize some of it. Reach out to your partners, local partners, to understand better what they're doing if you need the help, especially for some of those that haven't been through this process in the past. Okay, as I mentioned, the WIA notice that speaks to local negotiations is, you know, almost final, waiting final approval. So look for that in the e-policy portal on Illinois WorkNet in the next couple of days. Paul and I are finalizing the Q&A updates to reflect 24-25 program years, especially the local negotiation tool, and some of the questions that we want to make sure are addressed there. We'll take this session into consideration. We'll try to finalize that by the end of the week as well and get that posted on e-policy. And these documents are all tied to the e-policy WIOA policy 3.4 on general requirements for local negotiation. So take a look at that at the end of the week or early next week, and see what we've updated. The timeline is all there. The proposal forms are there, so you can go out there. You'll be able to go out there and utilize the new forms starting next week. And then again, under the technical assistance section, you'll find the Q&A document that we are updating. I don't see any other questions or comments in the chat. We'll give back a few minutes of your time. Appreciate your time in joining us, your participation and sharing of your stories. Andy, thank you as always for all the work you and Northern Illinois University does to support our efforts. And finally, thank the local members who are part of that work group that assisted Andy and Brian in developing the statistical adjustment model, and as well as the negotiation tool. Anyone that would like to be part of our work groups, we've got 3 of them going on right now, I think. Please let me know. We can find you a place if you want to participate, provide local input. We want to make sure that we are considering your concerns, your input when we're doing all of these efforts. And so we want to make sure you participate as much as you want to. So let me know if you want to be a participant. We'll find the right place for you based on your interests, and we'll have you join one of our work groups. Thank you again, and have a great day.